On December 20th, 1943, a crippled American B-17 bomber limped through the skies over Germany. Half the crew was dead or wounded. The tail was shattered. The nose was blown open to the freezing wind. The plane was so badly damaged that it should not have been flying at all. And then a German fighter appeared. Luftwaffe pilot Franz Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the broken bomber and looked into the cockpit. He saw a young American pilot struggling to keep his dying aircraft in the air. He saw wounded men bleeding in the fuselage. He saw a plane that was completely defenseless. Stigler had a choice. He could shoot down the bomber and claim his next victory. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. The bomber could not fight back. It would be easy. Instead, Franz Stigler did something that could have gotten him executed. He lowered his guns, flew alongside the American bomber, and escorted it toward the safety of the North Sea. 50 years later, the two pilots would meet again. This is their story. Charlie Brown was 21 years old and terrified. It was his first combat mission as a pilot. He had trained for months, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived in England ready to fight. Now he was flying a B-17 Flying Fortress named Ye Olde Pub into the heart of Nazi Germany. The target was an aircraft factory in Bremen. Intelligence said the flak would be heavy. Intelligence was right. As Brown's bomber approached the target, the sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Black puffs of smoke filled the air around them. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. Brown felt his plane shudder with each hit. They dropped their bombs and turned for home. That was when the fighters arrived. German Bf-109s and Fw-190s swarmed the formation. Brown watched in horror as bombers around him burst into flames and fell from the sky. Then the fighters turned on Ye Olde Pub. The first attack killed the tail gunner and wounded several other crew members. The second attack destroyed the nose of the aircraft, leaving a gaping hole that let in the freezing air at 15,000 feet. The third attack knocked out two engines. Brown fought to control his crippled plane as more attacks came. The oxygen system was destroyed. The hydraulics were gone. The compass was smashed. One by one, his guns fell silent as the gunners were killed or wounded. By the time the German fighters broke off their attack, Ye Olde Pub was a flying wreck. Of the 10 crew members, 1 was dead, 6 were wounded, and only 3 were still able to function. The plane was losing altitude, struggling to stay in the air. Brown had no idea where he was. His instruments were destroyed. His navigator was wounded. All he knew was that he had to fly west toward England, and he had to stay in the air long enough to get there. He did not know that he was flying directly over one of the most heavily defended airfields in Germany. Franz Stigler was on the ground at that airfield, drinking coffee and waiting for his plane to be refueled. Stigler was a veteran. He had been flying combat missions since the North African campaign. He had shot down dozens of Allied aircraft. He was 1 kill away from the Knight's Cross, the medal that every German pilot dreamed of receiving. When he saw the crippled bomber pass overhead, he immediately ran to his Messerschmitt and took off to intercept. This would be an easy kill. The bomber was alone, damaged, and defenseless. He would have his Knight's Cross before dinner. Stigler climbed to intercept the B-17. As he approached from behind, he prepared to fire. Then he got close enough to see the damage. The tail of the bomber was almost completely destroyed. The rear gunner's position was covered in blood. Through the holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see wounded men lying motionless. The plane was so badly damaged that he could not understand how it was still flying. Stigler moved alongside the bomber and looked into the cockpit. He saw a young pilot, barely more than a boy, fighting desperately to keep his aircraft in the air. The pilot looked at him with eyes full of fear, waiting for the bullets that would end his life. And Franz Stigler hesitated. Years later, Stigler would explain what went through his mind in that moment. He remembered something his commanding officer in North Africa had told him. The officer's name was Gustav Rödel, and he had given Stigler a piece of advice that stayed with him throughout the war. Rodel had said that if Stigler ever shot at a man in a parachute, he would shoot Stigler himself. There were rules even in war. You did not kill a defenseless enemy. You did not murder men who could not fight back. Looking at the shattered bomber, Stigler realized that this was the same situation. These men were already defeated. They were trying to survive, nothing more. Shooting them down would not be combat. It would be murder. Stigler made his decision. Instead of firing, he pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the bomber and tried to get Brown's attention. He gestured toward the ground, trying to tell him to land. If Brown surrendered and landed in Germany, his crew would be taken prisoner, but they would survive. Brown did not understand. He thought Stigler was playing some kind of cruel game before killing them. He ordered his one remaining gunner to try to fire at the German fighter, but the gun was jammed. Stigler saw the gun turret moving and realized that Brown did not trust him, so he tried something else. He flew in formation with the bomber, positioning himself so that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground could not fire without risking hitting their own plane. For several minutes, Stigler escorted the crippled bomber across German-occupied territory. He led Brown toward the North Sea, away from the anti-aircraft batteries, away from the fighter bases, toward the possibility of safety. When they reached the coast, Stigler pulled alongside Brown one more time. He looked at the American pilot, nodded, and saluted. Then he turned his Messerschmitt around and flew back toward Germany. Charlie Brown had no idea why the German pilot had spared him. He did not know the man's name. He did not know his reasons. All he knew was that he and his surviving crew members were still alive when they should have been dead. Ye Old Pub limped across the North Sea and somehow made it back to England. Brown managed to land the shattered aircraft at an American airfield. When he climbed out of the cockpit, ground crews stared in disbelief at the damage. They counted over a dozen major holes in the fuselage and hundreds of smaller ones. They could not understand how the plane had stayed in the air. Brown reported what had happened, including the strange encounter with the German pilot who had chosen not to shoot. His commanding officers told him never to speak of it again. A story about a merciful German pilot was not good for morale. The enemy was supposed to be evil. Complicated stories about honor between enemies did not fit the narrative. Brown followed orders. He completed his combat tour, flying many more missions over Germany. He never forgot the German pilot who had spared his life, but he kept the story to himself. On the other side, Franz Stigler also kept silent. He knew that what he had done was technically treason. Allowing an enemy aircraft to escape was a court-martial offense. If his superiors found out, he could be executed. So Stigler never told anyone. He finished the war, survived, and eventually immigrated to Canada, where he started a new life. He married, raised a family, and tried to put the war behind him. But he never forgot the young American pilot whose life he had spared. Sometimes he wondered what had happened to him. Had he made it home? Had he survived the war? Was he still alive somewhere, living the life that Stigler had chosen not to take? For decades, neither man knew the other's fate. The encounter remained a private memory, shared with no one, buried under the weight of years. Then in 1986, more than 40 years after the war, Charlie Brown decided to find the German pilot who had saved his life. Brown had retired from the Air Force after a long career. He had time now to think about the past, and the memory of that encounter over Germany had never left him. He wanted to know who the German pilot was. He wanted to understand why he had been spared. Brown wrote a letter to a newsletter for combat pilots, describing the encounter and asking if anyone knew the identity of the German pilot. He included every detail he could remember: the date, the location, the type of aircraft, the circumstances. For years, he received no response. The letter was published and republished in various aviation magazines, but no one came forward. Brown began to think that the German pilot must have died in the war or in the decades since. Then in 1990, a letter arrived from Canada. Franz Stigler had seen Brown's story in a newsletter. He had recognized the details immediately. The date was right. The location was right. The description of the damage was exactly as he remembered. Stigler wrote to Brown and confirmed that he was the pilot. He explained what had happened that day, what he had seen, what he had felt, and why he had made the choice he made. When Brown read the letter, he broke down in tears. After nearly 50 years, he finally had an answer. The two men arranged to meet in person. When they finally came face to face at a hotel in Seattle, they embraced like brothers. Stigler later said that it was as if they had known each other their entire lives. Brown said that meeting Stigler was one of the most important moments of his life. From that day forward, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became the closest of friends. They spoke on the phone constantly. They visited each other's homes. They attended aviation events together, telling their story to anyone who would listen. Stigler explained to Brown why he had made the decision to spare him. He talked about Gustav Rodel and the code of honor that some German pilots still maintained even in the midst of total war. He said that when he looked into that bomber and saw those wounded, helpless men, he could not bring himself to kill them. It would have made him a murderer, not a warrior. Brown asked Stigler if he had ever regretted the decision. After all, Stigler had given up the Knight's Cross, the medal he had worked so hard to earn. He had risked his life and his career for an enemy he did not know. Stigler's answer was simple. He said that he could live without the medal. He could not have lived with himself if he had killed those men. The story of Stigler and Brown became famous. They were featured in books, documentaries, and news programs. They traveled together to speak at schools and military bases, sharing their message of honor and reconciliation. In 2008, an author named Makos published a book about their story called A Higher Call. The book became a bestseller and introduced their remarkable friendship to a new generation. But time was running out for the two old pilots. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died just 7 months later on November 24, 2008, at the age of 87. They had been friends for 18 years. After spending most of their lives not knowing each other existed, they had found each other at the end and forged a bond that transcended the war that had made them enemies. At their funerals, both men were remembered not just as warriors, but as men of honor who proved that humanity can survive even in the darkest circumstances. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is not a typical war story. There are no great battles, no strategic turning points, no moments that change the course of history. But it is a story about something more important. It is about the choices that individuals make when no one is watching. It is about the power of mercy in a world consumed by violence. It is about the possibility of redemption and reconciliation even between former enemies. Franz Stigler was a German pilot fighting for a regime that committed terrible crimes. But in one moment, faced with a choice between killing and mercy, he chose mercy. That choice did not change the war. It did not stop the killing, but it saved the lives of 9 men and created a friendship that lasted until both pilots died. Charlie Brown spent most of his life wondering why he had been spared. When he finally got his answer, he did not find a complicated explanation or a strategic calculation. He found a man who had simply decided that some things were more important than medals and victories. Sometimes the most important stories from history are not about generals and battles. They are about moments when ordinary people choose to be extraordinary. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. We uncover the untold stories of World War II, the ones that history books left out. See you in the next video.